Now with Martin Sheehan. Science 101, an evening. The idea was to get students to see, analyze, and discuss two fundamentally different stories or memories. The Green Berets was a hit, but at the end, the room emptied and was filled with those who came to see Apocalypse Now. It was now becoming clear there would be no dialogue. And when the second film ended, the room emptied. And I turned off the lights and drove home wondering if education was my calling. I hope tonight, while different, is an even more successful venture, but teaching is never without risk. So let's see what we can do. I was drawn to this topic through a book published in 2016 entitled Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War by Viet Thanh Nguyen. The book is about war, memory, and identity. It proceeds from the idea that all wars are fought twice. The first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. For example, what some people call the Vietnam War, others now call the American War. And I've been corrected on this when I've been in Vietnam. These conflicting names indicate how this war suffers from an identity crisis as we engage the question of how it will be known and remembered. Moreover, war involves so many people because war is inseparable from the diverse domestic life of a nation. To think about war solely as combat and the male protagonist as a male soldier is too narrow. Few are not affected by the economic, social, political, and personal stresses, and inevitably, we are all casualties of a war. Tim O'Brien wrote a book that touched on the memory of war with the title, The Things They Carried. I might like to change this for us to The Things We Carry. My purpose tonight is twofold. First, to share with you my own story, to be sure it is personal, but I hope it also draws each of you into your own understandings of the war in Vietnam. It is not simply about combat, it is about the societies as a whole. Second, to draw your engagement into the larger and deeper discussion with others on the impact of this war, both on our private and public lives, and how this collective understanding shapes our future. Tim O'Brien spoke at St. Michael's some years ago. We were all moved as he read passages from his then latest work, which dealt with communications between a soldier and the soldier's sister. At the end, one student asked how he finally reconciled with his own sister. And he responded, I do not have a sister. There was a collective gasp. Let me quote Tim O'Brien further. Just because something never happened doesn't mean it isn't true. Whoa. Here we need to disengage ourselves from thinking of Vietnam memory as a history or a social science endeavor. That framework is too narrow. The topic is larger and shaped by both head and heart. We will not arrive at full and final answers tonight. At best, this can be part of a continuing dialogue, both private and public. Each of us must wrestle with the issues which I hope I can raise this evening. Where to begin? One way to start is to ask, what word comes to mind when you hear the word Vietnam? Let your thought flow from that query. Think about the chosen word and its meaning, and then begin the search to find out why and how that word became your memory of war. Toward that end, let us begin the journey. I've divided into 4 seasons. You'll note the Vivaldi at the beginning. As I indicated in the introduction, I think that's the only thing that kept me sane for a year, and probably for someone that didn't like Vivaldi, drove them into insanity. My mate in the cubicle played country and Western music all the time, which I have grown used to and love. But if I hear Roger Miller's "You Can't Roller Skate Through a Buffalo Herd" once more, I may be moved to violence. I've divided it into seasons, 4 seasons, not corresponding to our 4 seasons, but 4 seasons anyway. The first season, season 1, Seeds of Doubt, 1963 to 1965. In this first season, the optimism of American political life, its goals, its actions are challenged by the complexity over time of the American relationship to Vietnam and Vietnam's long history. When did the struggle for Vietnamese independence begin? Many would suggest the year 849, when the Chinese were ousted from Vietnam after 1,000 years of imperial rule. Freedom for a time, then French imperial rule, then Japanese occupation in World War II, then back to French control, and then perhaps the US. Let's draw back and start here. When did you first engage Vietnam? And by that, I mean, when did it come to your attention? In what way? What did it mean then? For me, it was June 1963. June 5th was graduation from the Air Force Academy, and I am on top of the world, graduating with high honors, leaving a place I had grown to despise, going to a year of graduate study in Columbia as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow. Our graduation speaker was John Kennedy, a presidency symbolized by youth and hope. Indeed, he claimed leadership of a team that would be known as the best and the brightest. This was also the title of a best-selling book analyzing this period and Vietnam policy. My favorite member of the team was Robert Mcnamara, the Secretary of Defense. By 1995, he would write a memoir entitled, In Retrospect, The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam. But this was a future few predicted. 6 days later, June 11th, 1963, the earth moves beneath me. In expressing opposition to the current Diem regime in South Vietnam, a Buddhist monk, Thich Quang Duc, commits suicide by self-immolation at a busy intersection in Saigon. The disturbing picture of this act was on the front page of the New York Times that morning. The reporters had been tipped off. It is said that John Kennedy kept the picture on his desk throughout the summer. And now the world is more complex, good and bad not so easily defined, and all ideas begin to turn from black and white into many shades of gray. For American policy, defining friends, enemies, and understanding the goals and supporting actions became more difficult for observers to understand. This complexity remained throughout the next year. President Diem's sister-in-law, Madame Nhu, went on a speaking tour of the United States and became famous for referring to the self-immolation as a monk's barbecue. I attended her talk at Columbia and chaos reigned. After pushing my way into the lecture hall, I recall the sound of thrown eggs hitting the windows in the midst of cries of protests. And I thought, we're not at the Air Force Academy anymore. Within 3 months, Madame Nhu's husband, her husband and President Diem were assassinated in a military coup which the United States passively supported. Madame Nhu and her daughter continued on to France and never returned to Vietnam. My year at Columbia was intellectually exciting, but it was all too short. And return to active duty drew me back into an old military routine. Intelligence school offered little thought, and the training seemed more devoted to photo interpretation than growing to understand what the field of intelligence would comprise and its significance. And so by the end of this first season, I found I had fundamental doubts about the goals and actions of American foreign policy, of which I was now a part. The easy notion of the work of the best and the brightest had become tarnished. In this time, I was drawn to the work of a young Buddhist monk. And I pause here to say, I learned how to pronounce his name today while I was at the doctor's. Doctor's age Vietnamese, and she tried to instruct me, mask to mask, how to say Thich Tri Quang. Then it didn't work, so she walked back 6 paces, took off her mask, and then Thich Nhat Han was much clearer, and I could say it, and we laughed. He was little known in the outside world, but his opposition to the Diem regime and American intervention and his thoughts on ending the war were powerful enough that he was driven from Vietnam by the military coup leaders of '63. He settled in France, where he established a meditation community, and at the same time remained a powerful voice in opposing the new South Vietnamese military regime and the National Liberation Front created by Ho Chi Minh, as well as an American intervention. I am of his generation, and while he fades from the story here, he returns at the end. I have not met him, but I have read many of his books, and we have been intellectual, if not spiritual, fellow travelers over these years in many ways. But in season 2, I found myself no longer viewing Vietnam from afar. Season 2, In Country, 1965, 1966. My interest in Vietnam deepened from the ongoing political events. Pivotal for me was a book by Bernard Fall, Street Without Joy. His analysis of the French and US engagement focused on the area near Da Nang, Vietnam, which was near the midpoint of North and South. The Street Without Joy was a highway close to the divided zone that was the regular site of heavy military action. The book was banned in Vietnam, which whetted my interest. And more out of curiosity than anything else, I volunteered for Vietnam. No heroics here. My intelligence clearances did not allow my assignment to combat areas. So the only place where I could be assigned technically was Saigon. When my orders came for Da Nang, I questioned my sergeant on the assignment. He smiled broadly and said, "Don't worry, Lieutenant. I got you a waiver." I did not smile. When I left for Vietnam a few months later, I smuggled Bernard Fall in my duffel. And here it is, well worn, still on my shelf, a little mildewed, but still Bernard Fall. In this second season, the war buildup continues and its execution through air power expands. There are 3 worlds. The inner core was the airfield, and the American cantonment protected by the Vietnamese Army on one side and the 3rd Division of US Marines on the other. Beyond the barbed wire was the city of Da Nang. It was remarkably and suspiciously free of fighting and terrorism. I speculated it was an open city to the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese Army, and of course, American troops. And finally, beyond Da Nang, a 3rd world that some referred to as Indian country. I gasped at the term, and I researched it on Google because I couldn't believe it. And it was in fact commonly used in Vietnam by American troops as a word for enemy territory, uncivilized and hostile. I will say no more. The first world, Da Nang Air Base, Little America inside barbed wire. After a month of tenting, rain, and rats, we moved into new barracks and took our meals at the Da Nang officers' open mess, the Doom Club. The bar never fully closed. Post-night mission whiskey was available at 0600. US South Vietnamese and Marines flew missions 24 hours a day, light bombers, fighter squadrons rotating monthly from Clark Air Base in the Philippines. Because of its proximity to the north and Laos, Da Nang was at the time the busiest single runway port in the world. On life, it was filled with incongruities. First of all, I had a cubicle mate with his love of country and Western music on his $200 Japanese stereo purchased at the base exchange. All M16 rifles were locked up and not available to personnel. We were not combat ready. I had a half-day training in the Philippines, and that was it. Air units from Clark Air Base came monthly and always filled their bomb bays with San Miguel beer. It was their gift to us. My intelligence counterpart at Clark flew in once a month, spent the day drinking at the Doom Club, and returned to Clark to apply for hazardous duty pay for the entire month, conforming to Air Force regulations. That one grated on me. My main job was to brief and debrief morning and night. Rise at 4 o'clock, off to the airstrip on a bike. Drink last night's coffee, light up a marsh-wheeling, rum-soaked cigar, and no more wake-up was necessary. We reviewed the intelligence for the day, went over mission folders, brief flights by 5, and the work was getting the attention of the crews to always debrief from the meetings. There were some alternate night missions for light bombers attacking the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Beyond some extraordinary pilots, the personnel structure was top-heavy and opportunistic. All of this led to what I thought was a certain petty corruption. The losses of planes and personnel were low. Military success was unclear. Damage was always obscured by smoke in after-mission reports. And for many, this war was about career moves, awards, medals, and promotions. If pilots flew 100 missions out of country, they could return to the US early. Some of these pilots had radar operators vector them over Hainan Island in the Gulf of Tonkin to get credit for a mission that otherwise would simply have been over international waters. The MiG aircraft were good aircraft supplied by the Russians. The Vietnamese pilots were probably not nearly as good. And so going north to possibly engage was always something that commanders wanted to do. So at times they would come back and find that they thought the MiGs would be up the next night. So there'd be a shuffle of flight rosters to make sure the commanders got there and got their glory. The base commander took Sunday flights. Since there was credit for every takeoff and landing as a combat mission, a base commander could just fly around Vietnam and probably get 5 or 6 credits toward an air medal during the day. Debriefing was always difficult. Generally, they were tired when they came back and would say the target was obscured by smoke. That was the standard entry. I recall one day when they came back and they said, 1 transportation vehicle destroyed. I paused and looked up and a couple were smiling. And I said, what was exactly the transportation vehicle? And the captain said, it was a water buffalo, but he really exploded. I was also in charge of escape and evasion, was hopelessly out of date. The kit that we were given somehow would be given to somebody who was bailing out over Germany. My instruction of the pilots and common sense said, if in fact you have to bail out, if you're captured, don't try and walk back from Hanoi to the DMZ. If you're captured, you're captured. Also in the E&E kits, there were maps to make your way back, and they were plastic, and they were really very nice. I found that the Vietnamese pilots came to me regularly and asked for more maps. Now, I knew they weren't being shot down, so I was a bit puzzled. And finally, since I was running out, I gave the head pilot, I said, look, I'm giving you 10 of these. Is 10 good? His eyes lit up. He thought that was great. I said, these are the 10 for you and your unit. His face was a little crestfallen, but he said, okay. I wondered what happened until I was biking through their compound one day and I saw all the escape and evasion maps. They were beautiful tablecloths. So I figured 10 was about enough, and that was it. There was, I think, at that time, a sense of sleepwalking toward your date of return. And even the rationalists walked quietly through their last 30 days in country. Short stories. Number 1, bananas. The base commander loved bananas. And there was a tree outside the Doom Club, and he bragged he would have those bananas for his breakfast when they were ripe. After the Doom Club closed one night, some junior officers climbed a tree with the smallest officer on top, cut down the bananas, and took them away. There was an ensuing military police investigation, which was unsuccessful. I will not confirm or deny this event took place. It's my understanding the bananas were very tasty. Story 2, mortared by Allies. A call at midnight. 2 planes were coming from Saigon with troops. The ARVN commander of the First Corps has mutinied. That is, the commander in charge of the South Vietnamese Army in the Northern Quarter was attempting to mutiny. There was a lockdown of US planes and the pilots were evacuated to Thailand. We sat there for a week not knowing what would happen with these incoming South Vietnamese forces that then essentially were protecting us at the air base from the troops in town. My only hope was, this is how you think about things, I was in charge of 5 safes that had lots of classified material, and I'm a terrible bookkeeper. So what we did was we put phosphorus grenades on top of each safe, and if we had to evacuate, we'd pull the plug on them, and all my bookkeeping problems would have been solved. I prayed, please let me pull the pin. Never happened. One morning, however, during this, we started to hear the mortaring of the base. And so we all ran outside and got into to bunkers. The discussion that ensued was fascinating, and it was whether you could get a Purple Heart from friendly fire. Since we were being mortared by our allies, it was a bit of a puzzlement. Story 3, a little help from my friends. The F-4 plane had 2 pilots, was a light bomber, 2 pilots with a front seat, head pilot, a major, back seat, a lieutenant. The major in the one squadron liked to check for damage. And so after a bombing attack, he would go back to the target area and circle around. His lieutenant, who we'll call Yossarian, with deference to Catch-22, came to me and said, he's going to get me killed. And I pondered. Before the morning briefing the next day, I took my magic marker, green for automatic weapons fire, and add some reported fire to the target map that we would go over. In my briefing, I turned to the major and said, take care, it could get hot out there today. When they returned at the end of the briefing, the major said, gee, it was really quiet. And I put on my Beth Jonathan Winter's voice and said, they're clever devils, Major. He nodded in agreement, and I got a week of thanks from Yossarian, who rotated home safely thereafter. Story 4, night attack. Someone in the Saigon headquarters came up with the idea that a night attack to lay mines upstream from bridges that were North Vietnamese passageways to the south would be a good idea. Special unit training took place, and they came to Da Nang, where they got a standard briefing from us. The mission was flown that night, but failed due to an equipment malfunction. The mine release gear jammed. Headquarters Saigon sent orders to repeat the mission for the next night. We knew it would fail because the surprise was the crucial element in the attack itself, and that was now lost. The mission was flown, the plane was shot down with the loss of all crew members. The fragmentation of information narrowed the war to a small tactical world. No larger sense of direction and purpose. We each had our little wars to fight, but we seemed to be going through the motions. The second world, Da Nang City, an open city for all, at least for a while. I went to Da Nang regularly. In contrast to most, I got to know the American consular officer, and through him got to know many local Vietnamese and teach English to adult learners. Even after the city of Da Nang became off limits, I traveled without difficulty. I grew to know a small circle of students and friends, and from them, I learned much. To remain inconspicuous for town wear, I dressed as many of the French teachers did at the local private school. Dark slacks, white shirt with long sleeves, never roll up the sleeves, sandals plain with socks, blue tinted sunglasses, a Vietnamese bike, and a small black briefcase to hold papers. I traveled easily by day and sometimes by night. Story 1, Thung. I met Fung after a high school talk, and he was very anxious to get more English tutoring. And so I said I would come 2 or 3 afternoons when I was off duty. For my security, I worried. How do I know he wasn't Viet Cong? So all I told him was I could not say which afternoons. And so I randomized those. And then I mapped out 3 alternative routes to go there and get back, and randomized which I took. And I never had a problem. For his family, they were very devoted and supportive. I found out there was no color printing in Vietnam. All film had to be sent to Hawaii. And so I took pictures of the entire family, individual ones and collective ones, sent the film to Hawaii, and then gave them to them as a gift. And they were just delighted. And it made me feel very good. He wrote this for me in a longer essay. I'm dreaming and I see a very handsome God who seems coming to liberate this star out of the black clouds and put him in the civilized world. And I will leisurely follow him to an extreme splendid land for sure. And I hope I will go back to give my poor and uneducated peoples the thought about the civilized world of mankind's love. I did not know how to respond. He had fallen in love with a dream, not reality. One afternoon, he showed me with pride his birth certificate. He explained he had saved enough money to have his birth date altered, so he had 2 more years before he would be drafted. I pondered. What was I doing 10,000 miles away from home, and he was dodging the draft? His logic was impeccable. If drafted, you served in the war until you won or you were killed. And the war had already been going on for 20 years. He had my address in the States, but I never saw or heard from him again. Story 2, Chow. Chow was a special student, a class picture that I have of her. She was always serious. I don't think she smiled in all the time I was there. One night I departed from the course outline for free discussion. And I said, ask me anything. After some low-level questions, she quietly asked me, why are you here? I stumbled, I restarted. I had no coherent explanation for her. She showed no reaction. In all the months teaching, I never saw her smile. When I was about to leave, I gave her my English Vietnamese dictionary, and she in turn gave me a book inscribed simply, a gift for you, Chow. It was a Vietnamese songbook, and I had it translated 20 years later by a Vietnamese St. Michael's student. The end of one song drew me in to the lyrics. I would sing loud, but less than others. When someday, we would all sing a song of bliss and joy, sing a song of love all together, the day of no war or no fire and smoke, the day my people live in peace. Story 3, Bar Girls. 2 streets in Da Nang were set off for courtesy bars for security. A 6-foot metal mesh fence barred the storefronts, and guards were on hand at the doors. For a $2 glass, fake champagne, the bar girls would talk and would listen. Most were from rural towns, and as bar girls, they made 3 to 4 times the pay they would as office workers. They sent the money home regularly, and families enjoyed this extended economy. But they never shared the source of their income with their parents. There were brothels, of course, but that was a different clientele. Story 4, RMK. RMK was the big-time construction contracting company in Da Nang. Big money. They lived in the hotels in town. Outside our office on the base one day, The boss was supervising his Vietnamese worker, trying to get him to work a backhoe. The worker panicked, and the Vietnamese started to giggle, often as a result of embarrassment or difficulty. But the more the RMK boss amplified his instructions, the more the worker giggled. The boss finally jumped into the cab, threw the Vietnamese off the cab, cursed him out, and did the job himself. And all I could think of was, I think, a Paul Newman movie where the guard said, "What we have here is a failure to communicate." Story 5, the temple. Perhaps the most enjoyable time for me was to visit the Buddhist temple and talk with the monks. They were always gracious, lent me books on Buddhism, but it was their style that captivated me. They were open and receiving. In the worst heat, we sat in the temple as the louvered shutters kept out the sun but welcomed the sea breeze. It was a reprieve. Cynical reality check. Their hospitality may have been due in part to the carton of Salem cigarettes I always brought on my visits. Story 6, the Viet Cong. Biking back from Da Nang, one passes through the outer perimeter that held the prison for Viet Cong. One day I stopped on my bike and surveyed the compound, which was providing the prisoners a few moments outside. As I looked, my eye caught one prisoner standing to the side, and his eye caught mine. And in that moment, was there a nod, a wave? We saw one another. But the war for me would never be the same. The enemy now had a face. The third world was that zone of the enemy and the unknown. For the Air Force, we were never in it, only over it. Season 3, the mission that never happened. Defoliation 1966. The effort to slow the flow of supplies and troops from the north down the Ho Chi Minh Trail expands with night missions and defoliation, memories of intelligence, camaraderie, and professionalism. The mission defoliation is a self-contained story. The defoliation unit deployed a few days a week from Saigon. Their mission to defoliate the Ho Chi Minh Trail on the north side of river crossings. Because the trucks went at night, they had to cross the rivers by ferry, and therefore they jammed up on the north side. So flare ships would fly over, bombers would come in at night to interdict. And since the trail was in Laos and the US Air Force didn't fly in Laos, planes were remarked. So all the planes had different markings when they flew to Laos, as they were South Vietnamese planes. And the Vietnamese officer was the commander of record. He flew in the back of the plane in an armored box, controlling the spray hoses. He wasn't really a pilot. The irony is he got airsick frequently and spent most of the war throwing up inside his armored box. The 309th Air Commando Squadron was a spirited group, purple scarves and a matching swagger. Because defoliation required low, slow, and repetitive sprayings, they were the most shot at and battle damaged unit in country. When my schedule allowed, I did go on missions, equipped with 2 flak jackets, one to wear, one to sit on. It was the most shot at because they flew at 150 feet, 120 miles per hour, and had to make 3 passes to complete the mission. One day the crew noted there was thatching over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but it wasn't in Laos, it was in North Vietnam. After discussion, they decided, spray it. There would be no orders or information at higher levels on the mission, which, if known, would be highly controversial. I did the research and background work with the understanding that I would be in the lead plane. I looked for any available information, could find nothing that suggested anti-aircraft threat, and my advice was, go. And so we went into North Vietnam, low and slow. In the first pass, there was an explosion of ground fire. It hit the right engine with uncertain damage. While the plane recovered, it was erratic instrumentation on the right engine damage, We declared emergency, headed back to base, and landed without incident. We drank a little more than usual that night. This was a mission that never happened. Intelligence is never very rewarding. You tell uncomfortable truths to the unwilling and often make mistakes which you don't have to pay for. At least this time, I was at risk with the crew. In the next week, I was surprised by a ceremony at the Dune Club and given a certificate which reads, "Let it be known to all that on the 26th day of April 1966, while performing aerial spray, mission of the crew of said aircraft experienced perforation of the aircraft by enemy ground fire to the extent of 2 hits. After replying in kind to the hostile forces, let it also be known that in the true spirit of aerospace-dom and with typical fortitude and conviction of a member of the 309th Aero Commando Squadron, First Lieutenant William Wilson readjusted his iron jockey shorts and continued his mission." We never mounted the mission again, but I was glad to have been part of it. And yet the story is not ended. On an academic study trip in the year 2000, our group visited what was called a peace village near Hanoi for children affected by Agent Orange aerial spraying. I bought a small statue from one of the boys with terrible deformities. He carved stone statues to sell to visitors. It was a carving of the monkey Izaru, one of the famous 3 from the Japanese proverb of the 17th century, "See no evil, hear no evil, do no evil." He is see no evil and has his hands over his eyes. I overpaid the boy for his carving and wondered where his family might have been in April of 1966. Izaru has been on my desk and mind ever since. A reminder, if your eyes are covered, it does not mean evil does not exist. For those affected by Agent Orange on both sides, it left a terrible legacy of war. Vermont Senator Leahy has been unrelenting in obtaining U.S. funds toward the cleanup. The last major undertaking is now underway in Saigon. And still the story is not ended. I was in discussion with one of my Vietnamese university students a few weeks ago, and somehow I mentioned the Peace Village and showed her my carved monkey. She beamed and reflected that she was a member of a club at a university that sponsored the Peace Village and visited it regularly. And so in some strange way, a circle was closed. Season 4, Doubt Redux, 1966-1975. The adjustments of return to a country in turmoil, personal and political. The war continues without clear result, and public opinion turns. The anti-war movement, life on a university campus, in graduate school. After my 365 days, I returned via commercial air. I bought a ticket to Boston to surprise a girlfriend. We had kept in touch by letter during my tour. She was now in graduate school and had a special friend. Having dodged the famous Dear John letter, I had dinner with her and moved to Philadelphia to see my parents. They were overjoyed to see me, but what to say, where to start? I honestly do not remember any elements of my first days at home. Yet these moments of the return are classic, and I urge you to see The Best Years of Our Lives, 1946, as one of the best presentations. Coming Home, 1978, that's a pretty good one too. Anecdote 1, high school friend says to me, "Hey, I haven't seen you around, where you been?" I reply, "Vietnam." "Oh," he says. He seems embarrassed and walks away. Anecdote 2, apocryphal. High school friend continues, "Why did you go?" My reply, "Why did you send me?" My final stop in my Air Force career was an analyst in a research center in the basement of the Pentagon. We ran a computer program called WALLOP, Weapons Allocation Optimization Plan. It assessed weapons by, read adults and children killed, by nuclear weapons in alternative scenarios. See Dr. Strangelove, 1964, I will say no more. When I completed my military obligation, I resigned my commission and was accepted. And by now, my doubts on the war were turning to judgments. In trying to sort out my feelings and ideas, I came across a book by Senator J. William Fulbright that encapsulated my judgments on an increasingly unpopular war. The book is entitled The Arrogance of Power. He wrote, "The causes of this malady are not entirely clear, but its recurrence is one of the uniformities of history. Power tends to confuse itself with virtue, and a great nation is peculiarly susceptible to the idea that its power is a sign of God's favor, conferring upon it a special responsibility for other nations, to make them richer and happier and wiser, to remake them, that is, in its own shining image." The stories that capture the variety of events, I probably will skip through a little bit. I was a member of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I also worked with a large group within graduate school that opposed the war. And we had a variety of activities. Just some of them. One was tea in Somerville. Now, if you know Somerville, Massachusetts, that's about the last place you're going to sit down and have tea. But we went around and invited neighbors to come in the afternoons for tea and cookies, and we talked to them about the war. I have no idea whether it worked or anything else. The best one is graduation dinner. Fletcher can be stuffy, and it was headed by a Foreign Service officer named Dean Gullion, who had been working at the Saigon embassy. And after the graduation dinner, quite formal, we adjourned to a small lecture hall, and Dean Gullion started to explain all manner of things. And sitting about 2 rows behind me was an activist named Jeremy Rifkin. And Jeremy stood up and he said, "You know, Gullion, this is a bunch of shit. You guys are nothing but imperialists just following after the French." Gullion was flustered. You could have heard a pin drop. And Gullion asked him to leave. And in a beautiful moment that captured for me the 60s, Jeremy, he was wearing a cowboy hat, said, "No, you're going to have to throw me out." There was silence. The dean had his assistant dean try and do it. And in fact, we were knocking over chairs and everything else. And there were two sides to the story. Some thought Jeremy was an angel. Others thought he should be shot. There was that kind of polarization. Another story, I wanted to go to the Vietnam Veterans Against the War demonstration in Washington. I pawned my class ring, which would really be blasphemy. I don't think I've ever told my graduate cohorts that. Pawned my class ring for $25 for a bus ticket. We slept on the mall. The interesting thing was, since the anticipation was we would be arrested, we all taped dimes in our armpits and wrote the telephone number of Ramsey Clark Jr. Of the Justice Department, because he had offered to take care of us if we were arrested. It went from Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I think. The return of the medals was the most emotional moment when there was the judgment that people were turning back to the government the medals that they had been given. I was not there for it. And the answer is because I had a class Friday afternoon that I was teaching. And as most of you, I hope, know, I don't cancel classes. So I gave my medals to another fellow and he threw them on the steps of the Capitol. And that's where they were until they were collected. And I don't know where they're stored today. After that, it was coming home to Vermont. I simply needed to be close to nature after all these experiences and the years. And I tended to take weekends there. And I ended up with the last money I had as I finished graduate school, buying 10 acres in Walden that I camped on. The one remaining concern I had was that while my resignation had been accepted, I was still on inactive reserve and could be called up. Many in graduate school were avoiding the draft. One had braces put on his teeth. Others rigged their blood pressure. There were a few others that simply left the country and left Fletcher. I decided if called up, I would move to Canada. And since my dissertation research involved regular trips to McGill Library in Montreal, there was opportunity for thought and acculturation, and I quietly had planned for that eventuality, but it never came. After writing 100 letters of inquiry for teaching, I had one interview with Dr. George Olje, who gave me the job. Now, I admit that in winter conditions and his Hungarian accent, I got only about a half of what he said. And ironically, I think it was my military background that was my asset to hiring. Upon retirement in 2008, I built a cabin on the land, no electricity, no plumbing. It's our retreat. One last story. Lee Adams was my roommate at the academy senior year. He's a huge guy. He was a football player, and we made an odd couple walking along. He loved flying more than anything. I rejected pilot training. We drifted apart after graduation. In perusing academy class notes, decades later, I came across an article on Lee. He was killed in action in April 1966, only about 60 miles from my base at Da Nang. He was flying out of Thailand. His plane was hit by hostile fire. He ejected and was near death when a local villager found him. The villager, concerned that the body would be used inappropriately as a political rally, gave Lee the last Buddhist rites and buried him. Over a decade later, when US teams were searching for American soldiers' remains, the villager came forward. The remains were tested and the DNA analysis confirmed it was Lee, and his remains were shipped to his parents. After reading the story, I sent a letter to Lee's brother, the only address I had, and asked if he could give me Lee's parents' address. I then sent them a rather long letter, sharing our times together and reflecting on the war. As I did not feel I could simply parrot patriotic phrasing, I explained my own difficulties with the war, but recognized Lee's heroism and commitment. I asked if they would send me the name of the village and the villager, promising I would go there when in Vietnam to honor the villager for his act. They never wrote back. And that's a true war story. I never visit Washington without an early morning visit to Lee and to the wall. How to close? I turn here not to an academic document, but rather literature. From one side, Bao Ning wrote a book of his war experience in his novel, The Sorrow of War. Writing about one of his comrades, he wrote, I envied his inspiration, his optimism of focusing back on the painful but glorious days. They were caring days, when we knew what we were living and fighting for and why we needed to suffer and sacrifice. Those were the days when all of us were young, very pure, and very sincere. Bao Ning served in the glorious 27th Youth Brigade. Of the 500 who went to war with the brigade in 1969 from North Vietnam down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, he is one of 10 who survived. From the Other Side, a poem by Michael Davis O'Donnell, written January 1st, 1970. If you are able, save a place for them inside you, and save one backward glance when you are leaving for places they can no longer go. Be not ashamed to say you love them, though you may or may not have always. Take what they have left and what they have taught you with their dying, and keep it with your own. And in that time when men decide and feel safe to call the war insane, take one moment to embrace those gentle heroes you left behind. Lieutenant O'Donnell was killed in action 2 weeks later. That is the sorrow of war. And finally, let me turn to my initial query. What word would you choose at the prompt of Vietnam? I had settled on one last week, but awoke yesterday morning after a fitful sleep, and the clouds parted, and the word for me is hubris. Hubris is a trait that features excessive pride or inflated self-confidence, leading a protagonist to disregard a divine warning or violate an important moral law. The extreme pride or arrogance of hubris often consumes a character, blinding them to reason and resulting in their ultimate downfall. If there is a thread that runs through this American experience, for me, it is hubris. Americans treated the Vietnamese and their civilization as backward and almost childlike. Recall Phuong's contempt for his own society and the expectation a handsome God would lead him back to civilization. What? We taught the Vietnamese to run construction machinery, to use sophisticated weaponry, to serve our needs, and even to forsake their language for ours, as I taught them English. Did we know of the ruins of the thriving 13th century Cham civilization 10 miles from Da Nang? Did we know of the Vietnamese overthrow of Chinese imperialism before the year 1000? Or the famous Trung sisters, who headed a rebellion against the Han dynasty in 39 AD and set up an autonomous Vietnamese state? Or the central role of Hue as the intellectual and cultural capital in Vietnam in the 18th and 19th centuries? Who are the uncivilized here, and who are the barbarians? Let me partially rehabilitate my fallen hero, Robert Mcnamara. In his memoir of the war, he wrote, "Our misjudgments of friend and foe alike reflected our profound ignorance of the history, culture, and politics in the area, and the personalities and habits of their leaders." And so the two heroes for me in this reflection are Robert Mcnamara and Senator J. William Fulbright. And I confess my own shortcomings in teaching English with a self-assurance of its virtue that bordered on a benevolent arrogance. I am learning. Every class lesson in my current courses has a segment on Vietnamese for the teacher to learn. Its direct value is minimal, but there are two important outcomes. First, as I stumble through my effort to pronounce the unpronounceable, I am taught humility, a prerequisite for anyone who aspires to teach. Second, to include Vietnamese language in my curriculum is to demonstrate the value and respect I accord to the Vietnamese and their civilization. Through this, we meet on common ground and are both the better for it. It's time to close the circle. I began with Thich Nhat Hanh in 1963 and his protests against the government with which the United States was aligned. His was a voice of honesty and clarity in seeking some middle ground. It raised doubt in me then. Over my Vietnam experience in War and Peace, I've begun to understand and respect another culture. And Thich Nhat Hanh has helped me build that bridge and take some steps across it. I share many of Han's ideas and also share our mortality, for we are the same generation. He is now 93. I am in my 80th year. 2 years ago, he ended his exile in France and with the permission of the Vietnamese government, returned to die in his home temple in the ancient capital and intellectual center of Vietnam, Hue. The work of our generation is nearing an end. And yet, I still think there's a place for dialogue between the Green Berets and the Apocalypse Now. If only I can get everyone to watch both films together and stay for the discussion. I'll have to work on it. Thanks for allowing me to share this time with you and the things I carry with me. I'm happy to turn it over to Angela to answer, or at least try to answer, any questions you have. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. That was fantastic. A lot of wonderful stories. I see there's a couple things in here that I wanted to ask on behalf of our guest. Pat Fitzgibbons said, I took your excellent war and literature class with Laurie Smith, and I always wondered, from your perspective, whose opinion of the war and our role in it evolved more over the years until we took that course.
What? Great question, Pat. Who evolved more? I don't know. I guess that's the answer. Because I've stayed close to Vietnam through the years. I've been back 4 or 5 times. My wife and I went back when I was practice teaching for my TESOL degree from St. Michael's. I've changed more as a person, and I've changed my thoughts on Vietnam too. That's all I can say. As far as who changed how much, I don't know. We try not to step on one another's toes that way. So that's my answer, Pat. Sorry.
Brenda McDermott asked, have you had more positive or negative responses to your service in Vietnam from US citizens? And then how do you react? Do you have any conversations that stand out?
I don't wear it on my sleeve. And since I was not a career officer, I'm not identified professionally as kind of, oh, he's the guy that was in the service. When I talk, I never blurt it out, and it comes out in some kind of a context where it's there. Because I have kind of moved from one place to another, people don't talk about it much anymore. After the war, during the war, yeah. And it was just very polarized. When I was in graduate school, the graduate dorm had 2 televisions on either side of the commons room. Everybody that was pro-war was on one side, anti-war on the other side. So that was a polarizing period. We're polarized now, but not in the same way and about the same things. I think there's more common ground now. We've all gotten a little mellower.
There's a question from Brian. Dr. Wilson, I have admired your ability to get to the issue. In September 1973, my first class, you asked, does power corrupt? Does absolute power corrupt? Absolutely. You have this evening shared a very personal experience imbued, if not dominated, by power. So after 48 years, I'm curious of your perspective. Is it just dialogue or more? This has been most fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, it may be someone scratch their head and say, geez, the guy didn't learn much. He never changed his mind. Power takes different forms, but it does seem to me it's there. It's so easy to be abused. I've had a very privileged life, and part of learning that privilege has been to come to grips with the fact that I have a lot more power than I thought I had or should have had. So I'm leery when these things confront. My life story is kind of fascinating at this point. I only found out when I was 55 years old that I was adopted. So all the kind of legacy issues that people talk about, family traits and stuff like that, it was all pretty much on my own. First one in my family to ever go to college at all. And so I kind of thought, well, I'm kind of working my way up. But no, I had lots of privilege. Doors open for you when you've been to a service academy and things like that. I do worry about power. That's still a worry. Putting it in any one place is a dangerous thing to do. And so you can apply that to political theory. You can apply it to a household. You can put it to any social gathering. How to put checks on it, how to act with restraint, how to keep it within boundary. That's a boundary that's there as a part of the human condition. We are all subject to it. That the Greeks wrestled with hubris and the problems of, we had all these good traits as a society, but there was a fatal flaw. And that was that arrogance of power, I think, that came out, and why hubris became my thing. So that's it. It's there. It's if you're looking at politics as a profession, a lot of time is going to be spent on power.
Mark Popecki asked, what should the U.S. have done in Vietnam? Would complete disengagement been wise, or rather a different sort of engagement?
Yeah, I think that was the war ever winnable at any point? I don't know. I think it was flawed from the beginning. We had an overwhelming anti-communist agenda, and that tended to blind us to some of the other things. If you go back now, my wife and I sat at a diorama at the Army Museum in Hanoi, and they were acting out for a group of young junior high school students the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And they had red lights and blue lights, and they talked about no one thought that the French didn't think that anyone could handle them because they were there and they were going to draw in the Viet Cong and the National Liberation Front. They were going to smash them. And then you start to see the footage of the Vietnamese actually disassembling artillery pieces and carrying them on mules up to the high ridges around Dien Bien Phu. And then they start turning on red lights, blue lights turning red, and these kids are going wild. I mean, this was really their idea of what Vietnam was all about and the power of obtaining that freedom. We had no idea how strong and deeply held that sense of independence and freedom was. And we just didn't play it right. Could somebody else have played it better? You know, history weighs heavy on this. You know, the history of the mid 20th century and in Asia, and questions that were there in terms of the threats of China. We all live with historical analogies. Someone said the most important thing about, I guess, Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State in that early period, is that he was the Assistant Secretary of State during the Korean War. That his experience was North coming south, communists coming south, red tide taking over the world. And he said the second most important thing is nobody remembers that was Dean Rusk then. That Dean Rusk held on to a historical model that was outdated. I don't think we had an alternative historical model that we could successfully work with. So it's easy to say hubris and all the other things, and it's a fair retort to say, if you're so smart, how come you didn't do it a different way? I think it could have been done if we slowed down, if we took longer, if we had more negotiation, but there are all kinds of pressures that came in. I do think the best and the brightest was problematic. There was an arrogance there. And one of my real tragic heroes is Robert Mcnamara, because I was one of that crowd that really believed in statistics. I was delighted that Mcnamara was there because he could smack down generals who couldn't explain why they needed 27 tanks, but said they needed them. And maybe they did, but the analysis just wasn't there for Mcnamara. And if it wasn't there, he would reject it. So maybe you don't need a Ford in your life, since I think that's what he had, a Ford Motor Company. I'm rambling, but I don't have any clear answer of an alternative route. We pushed too hard. We put too many troops in. We were ignorant. So you could say if we were wiser and took more time, it might have been better. I hate to rewrite history with that. I don't have it. Sorry.
A lot of people are just making comments and statements, and I just want to make sure that everybody knows that we're going to download all of this, and I'm going to make sure that Dr. Wilson sees all of this. So even if I don't read things out loud, please know that he will see your comments tomorrow when I send it to him. We do have time for I think we have time for a couple more. Sure. Is that okay? A couple more questions? Okay. Brian Rook asks, Dr. Wilson, firstly, thank you for tonight. And next, are you concerned that whatever lessons of our involvement in Vietnam will recede and be lost for future generations?
Well, hello, Brian. I think there is a problem with our history in this sense. We're winners, and nobody likes a loser. And it is arguable as to what we can take away from this, or to put it more bluntly, what we are prepared to take away from it. What are we prepared to sit down and roll up our sleeves and say, these are the mistakes we made? Robert McNamara has 11 mistakes that we made. I just chose one of them. How you close the loop across generations is an interesting one. I think really one of the things that saddens me more than anything else in the last months is the extent to which there is not a linkage and a continuity between our chief executives, which has been there before. That people need to sit down across different administrations, go up to Camp David, stay there for a month, but talk about what each individual learned. There's a learning process that's there. Sometimes it can exist within an institution. I think nobody wants to go back and look at this now. It's the fart in the room. No one wants to take ownership or to look at it because there's not much good we can walk away from. So yeah, I really worry about this, that this will be the one that's tucked away in the closet. If we have another one that's similar that succeeds, that will blot out forever the loss. So that's the danger. You generally learn from your losing, but I don't know that. I don't know that the government has taken that on. I don't know that people have taken it on. We all have excuses as to why it didn't work, and they may not be correct. Thanks, Brian.
I think we've got time, one or two more. Paul Hennessy asked, have you lived with your Vietnam experience every day of your life, and how did the experience change you?
Yeah. Well, as my stories relate, I was not on the ground in the war. I've read a lot about it. I think The Matterhorn is probably the finest novel that I've read. It deals with an area of the country that I knew in the North, but it's a Marine novel. I think for me, it was a little more abstract, a little more distant. There were those moments of sheer panic, but not a lot, nor was I dealing with the death of close friends on a regular basis. That's a world that I did not have to deal with, and therefore I don't deal with it every day. That I never want to give it up is a part of the fact that Vietnam is always a part of me now. And so right now I consider 2 days a week I'm in Da Nang. I teach my classes online, but I always read the newspaper, the Da Nang Times, the Hanoi News, the Saigon Post. I always read them during the week. So I know what's going on there. I know what and I know a new generation of Vietnamese, which is really exciting. I love it to talk to new students, what they want to do, what their hopes are. We don't talk war. Sometimes we mention what their fathers did in the war, but not much. I live there. I'm sensitive to it. I don't wake up every morning with a guilt complex, but I wake up every morning with the opportunity and the obligation to do better. So that's why I teach English in Vietnam. It's giving back something that seems worthwhile.
A couple of people wanted to know if you've read a couple books. One is The Quiet American by Graham Greene.
Now that's the one I tried to work in and could not work into the talk. That's my favorite. Everyone should see it. Now, I tell people, see both movies. There are two movies of the Quiet American. The first one was done in the 50s, and they took some guy who's a Hollywood star, and they took Graham Greene's novel, which is very critical of America and Vietnam, and they turned it into a Cold War story. And Graham Greene was outraged. He tried to sue them, but he had sold the rights, and they made it anyway. The second, and I think very good one, is Michael Caine. And that one came out just before the Iraq War. And I wanted to see it so badly. And the movie houses maybe had a day or two and got rid of it. My wife and I drove to Montreal to see it there. So he's taking the conflict early on. And the problem with the Quiet American is a certain naivete about how the world operates, and certainly a blindness, an ideological blindness toward the Vietnamese. So it's a clash of civilizations, a clash of guilt and innocence. I have a hard copy. It's my go-to book, and I do go back to it with some frequency. So yeah, that's one I would put on my list. Was there another one?
Yes, Neil Sheehan's Bright Shining Lie.
Yeah, Bright Shining Lie. Yeah. There are so many really good books there. Bright Shining Lie is interesting because it's about a military officer who he's a very complex person, and part of this is what is truth, what is not truth, what do you report back to base, what do you do out there. It's kind of a good person who is swallowed up by a more complex world in some ways, and we were all pretty naive in Vietnam. So yeah, that's another good one. There's a lot of good stuff on Vietnam. The problem is if you read too much of it, I think you tend to get fairly depressed. The best book right out now is called The Mountains Sing. It's a wonderful book of Vietnamese history from World War II to the present, taught through multi-generations of Vietnamese families. But it's a novel. It's really, really excellent. And I like that. I like other books by Gwyn. He's a professor. I made reference to him initially. That's about the only academic book he's written. He's written 3 or 4 other novels. He's got a new novel coming out. He's very articulate. He may be a little too sophisticated for me in some ways, but it's a good read, talking about what it's like to be a boat person, because he came on a boat.
How about one more, and then we'll call it. Do you see any merit or morality in the basic premise that got us there in the first place to help a perceived ally?
Well, I mean, the kicker there is a perceived ally. I mean, I think a lot of people took a hard look at Diem, and that's really when things start to fall apart. And Diem, if anybody took a serious look, you would not think of him as an ally or as someone who represented the Vietnamese. You know, foreign policy is most often not picking the good choice, but the least bad choice. And I think we just calculated incorrectly, and we didn't pick the right one to back, and we stuck with him too long, and we never tried to look for alternatives. We missed that understanding. And then it went downhill.
Well, I just want to thank you on behalf of everybody who is on tonight's Zoom. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing all your personal stories. This chat's blowing up. I'll be sure to download all these comments and share them with you. Can
I get my last comment in?
Yes, of course. Please.
And that's gratitude to old teachers. I really appreciate this event. And when I thought about it, it struck me that I had some old teachers that I really did like. They weren't always in the classroom. So when you think about old teachers that have taught you, for me, who came to mind was Bob White. Now, Bob White was the class of 1952 at St. Michael's. And after graduation, he went in the Foreign Service. He specialized in inter-American affairs. He served every president from Eisenhower through to Reagan. But he got into some trouble. He was a deeply committed person on behalf of human rights. And in 1980, the then administration was not so concerned with human rights as they were anti-communism. And so these two were forces, and the ambassador deeply agreed with any relaxation. So I'll just quote a little bit here. In 1980, 8 months after the assassination of Archbishop Romero, who worked tirelessly for human rights, 4 Maryknoll nuns returning from dinner at the American ambassador's residence were assaulted and killed by military ambush. At the graveside, Ambassador White was heard to state, "This time they're not going to get away with it." And so he struck out with all kinds of actions that he might take as ambassador. This made the government in Washington unhappy with him. And in fact, he was stricken from the Foreign Service. He stood up for his principles. This is what one of the colleagues wrote. He stood up for his principles, which reflected the values of the American people, a belief in democracy and human rights. His courage cost him his job, but he never wavered, spending the rest of his life in advocating for those ideals. What he taught me was sometimes principle is more important than profession. And all the costs that he bore were a lesson to me. So he goes up there for me tonight as one I would put. There is a poem I will close with that's not too long. It's by Robert Bly. It's called Gratitude to Old Teachers. When we stride or stroll across the frozen lake, we place our feet where they have never been. We walk along the unwalked, but we are uneasy. Who is down there but our old teachers? Water that once could take no human weight, we were humans then, and students, holds up our feet and goes ahead of us for a mile. Beneath us, the teachers, and around us, the stillness. So thanks again for the opportunity. I wish you all well. Send me a postcard sometime and we can chat.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. And if I can say one thing about Ambassador White, I don't know if anybody on this call was there at reunion in 2012. We gave Ambassador White the Donald Cook Award. Donald Cook, for those of you who know who he was a colonel in the Vietnam War where he died. He was a POW who passed away in Vietnam. And that award is named for him. So I like how that kind of is a full circle moment right there. Thank you. On behalf of all of us, I appreciate the time that you took to prepare for tonight and for being our very first Emeriti faculty speaker. I did want to just plug a couple of quick things. Father Barabee will be speaking next Wednesday, March 24th on St. Mark's Passion. Most of you know. A lot of you are signed up. A link for that Zoom will be coming soon. I also really am excited to let everybody know that, and she's on here tonight as well, class of 1993, Luong Ung, will be leading our SMC Reads book discussion on May 19th. She will lead that discussion on her book, Lulu in the Sky. She is our very first alumna who will be leading SMC Reads. We're so grateful to her for doing that. And thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it and we'll hope to see you soon. Thank you.